and I would argue probably most of Europe, where people aren't buying that ideology anymore. It doesn't matter where they come from in the political spectrum. This is what saw the insurgency of Sanders and the insurgency of Trump. And so what you've seen is critics of capitalism and imperialism, such as myself, have already been pushed to the margins of the internet, locked out of public broadcasting even. Chomsky, all of us. But what they're doing now is using Google algorithms to further cut us off from the public. So for instance, I write for Robert Scheer's great website, TruthDig. I don't know if you know Bob Scheer, former editor of Ramparts, one of the great icons of American journalism. And Google and Facebook and Twitter, in the name of fake news, of course. And we had this shadowy group called Prop or Not, Propaganda or Not, enlisting all the major left-wing sites, Counterpunch, antiwar.com, Alternet, World Socialist website, my site, TruthDig, as being purveyors of fake news on the part of the Kremlin. And the Washington Post played it up. And so anyway, that gave the excuse for these algorithms. And what they do is they have something called impressions, where if you went into Google and typed imperialism, and I had written before the impressions were cut an article on imperialism, it would come up with other articles. Now those algorithms lock me out. So we've seen a graph in the last 12 months in TruthDig with over 700,000 referrals from impressions dropping to over 200,000. All of the left-wing sites have been decimated. Alternet's lost 63%, Counterpunch, Black Agenda Report, and that coupled with the abolition of net neutrality are an effective weapon. And I think that's because the ideology has lost credibility and is bankrupt, these marginalized critics suddenly become much more dangerous. And again, you go back to all of the indicators of a system that is in the death throes, and that loss of credibility is key. And so coupled with it has seen, certainly within the United States, horrific forms of state violence, state intrusion, militarized police. 3.3 Americans, almost all unarmed, are shot and killed every day in the streets of American cities. Mass incarceration. We have created in marginal communities, as you know, I would call them, militarized zones of terror. That's not too strong a word. I mean, if you're a mother with a young African-American son and it's dark, you don't know if they're ever coming home, and it's because of the cops.
But aren't the grievances that the groups like Antifa have, aren't they valid?
Well, I share some of them on the left, of course. But, I mean, this could be a whole evening on anarchism. I mean, the anarchists support pornography, which I don't. They support prostitution, which I don't. They believe, and I think this particularly affects the vulnerable and in particularly protects women, that, for instance, if you're raped, you shouldn't go to the police because you're a snitch. I'm not opposed to policing when it's carried out for public safety. I am opposed to policing when it's carried out to shoot people and oppress people of color.
So what police force in the world would you say is getting it right?
I would say police should not carry weapons. It's a better way to say it.
And there are police forces in the world that don't.
Well, I mean, the old Bobby didn't carry a weapon. But I mean, this gets into the whole, what was the British police force? Well, it was based on Peel's formation of a home guard in Ireland to stop and then exported to Britain to break. And I mean, police forces were created in the Peel model to suppress radicals. I mean, that's what they did in Ireland, and that's what they did in Britain. But you create the veneer of creating a police force around criminality, which it almost never is. and the United States followed that Peel model because we had the bloodiest labor wars in the industrialized world. I mean, hundreds of American workers were murdered by gun thugs, Pinkertons, Baldwin Felts, company goons, and local police forces, because they were local, identified with the workers, so they had to create state police forces and private militias. That's, the Pennsylvania State Police, which were brutal especially in the old coal fields and stuff in Pennsylvania. They used to call them the Pennsylvania Cossacks. So that gets into a whole other issue of why do we have police? Well, it's not why we're told we have police. But nevertheless, having lived in the former Yugoslavia, where all hierarchical systems of authority had been destroyed, or having worked in places like the Congo, where it was, whoever had the biggest trunk load of AK-47s took over, I have a healthy respect for order. The problem is who manages that order and what is their intent.
So I want to go back to corporate America, which, as we know, you're very critical of, but having lived in the US, one thing I would say, and even here, one thing I'm struck by is the level of innovation that comes out of America. And you could say, and people do say, that partly it's to do with the fact that money is a huge motivator. When there is, the potential to make millions of dollars, people do invent things that do end up doing good for society. One example I can think of is I am a mother of a child with special needs. What the machinery that helps her eat, that helps her walk, all invented in the United States. So is there a concern that if we take money as a motivator away from people, that it affects innovation, that ultimately helps people as well?
No, I mean, the problem is that, those particular, let's talk about Silicon Valley. So those innovators themselves make a lot of money. But what they do is all of that technology is built in sweatshops in China or Bangladesh, where workers live under Dickinsonian conditions that replicate the hell of industrial England in the late 19th century. And we know from China, I mean, you have whole cities that are making, Apple, everybody's out there, of 100,000 people, but they're secret. I mean, the security apparatus is such that you can't get in there, you can't film it. They live in these horrific dormitories. There's constant wage theft. And so if they don't meet their production quotas, they're not paid.
All that totally true.
Yeah,
I mean,
but
I don't think there's.
So it's
yeah.
not, these people who are innovators should not be given a free pass to be predators. That's the point. That's the problem.
You also write it in your book, when a government watches you 24 hours a day, you cannot use the word liberty. This is the relationship between a master and a slave. In your view, are there any successful ways that citizens can resist this constant surveillance? Because I know, if you're worried about the NSA listening to your call, you still have to get through your day and make your calls. So the tendency is to say, okay, well, they're watching me anyways. There's nothing I can do.
Well, it's worse than that. I mean, Facebook, I don't know why anyone's on Facebook. I'm not. We have handed all of our information. It's called the black box industry. It's now a multi-billion-dollar industry. So they have everything on us. Our health records, our employment records, and the danger of that, as Hannah Arendt points out in Origins of Totalitarianism, is that when a government has wholesale surveillance of an entire population, it's not because they're looking for crime. It's because they have information, and we saw that especially under Stalinism, where they pull up your file and they will find something for which they will criminalize you for. And you can be sure that in a moment of societal breakdown, our corporate masters will use it. Now, and also remember that in the United States, 70% of all government intelligence is contracted out to corporations like Bose Allen Hamilton. And you can be sure they're not just spying on us for the US government.
But what do you see as a solution? Not be on Facebook?
Well, there are other issues with Facebook. You can read Empire of Illusion about that. Facebook is about that whole, me, the life movie. It's about presentation. It's not about truth. And it kind of sucks you into this black hole of narcissism and trivia, and it's a giant waste of time. And it hands to the owners of Facebook all of your personal data, all of your friends' personal data that they sell. That's the business model. This kind of thing about people being surprised at Cambridge Analytica. No, that's their business model. That's why they have Facebook. That's why their stock is worth so much. Well, it's declined, but so it's very hard to escape from the electronic tentacles. But when I'll give an example. So I was in Zuccotti Park during the Occupy movement quite a bit. And after the mayor, Bloomberg, attempted to seize the park and failed, it was clear to the activists that they would come again. But this time they would come without any warning, probably as they did in the middle of the night. And so the Direct Action Committee wanted to prepare some kind of surprise for the NYPD. So they all came down to my house in Princeton, slept all over my floor, and everybody sat at the dining room table. All electronic devices this was before Snowden, so they were very prescient. All electronic devices were put in the car, phones, computers, everything in the car in the driveway. Nobody spoke, everybody wrote on pieces of paper and handed them back and forth, and then we burned them in the fireplace. And when the NYPD came, they stormed the park, and it was pretty brutal. And they got to the kitchen area in the center of the park, and they found 20 activists chained to the kitchen, and they didn't have chain cutters. And that was it was like, you don't know everything. It was Pyrrhic, and yet kind of cool. So I think we have to be aware of how, and I think one of the things that's was so disturbing after Barack Obama, in a nationally coordinated effort, shut down all Occupy encampments in America, was that because these people had communicated through electronic devices, they knew who the key figures were. And in the months following, I can speak, I'm sure it was national, but I know from New York, there were, and it didn't get much reporting, but they were bursting into lofts where people were squatting and stealing all their computer equipment. They were taking, I mean, it's not a surprise, they got the right people. They were taking them and fabricating felony convictions against them and forcing them to plea out. So for instance, one activist was charged with holding a pair of scissors and carrying out what was called an attempted assault, a deadly assault against a police officer. Now they filmed Zuccotti 24 hours a day, but of course they didn't film that assault because it didn't exist. And it was his word against the cops. And he had to plea out on a 5-year felony conviction, which means that if they pick him up for anything else, he goes to prison for 7 years. And that was a very effective technique to neuter the best activists. It's very dark what's happening. It's subterranean because all of the resistance is subterranean. If you watch the 24-hour burlesque show on CNN, you won't see it. You'll see a porn star and her lawyer, who now wants to run for president, and Omarosa, who has about as much credibility as Donald Trump. And they love it. They make money on it. It's entertainment, has zero to do with news. Meanwhile, these very serious movements are taking place within the country. And I would also add, there very profound suffering by at least half the population or more. And they're rendered utterly invisible. And I think that's why the credibility, and I think rightly so, of the press, and most people when they speak of the press now speak of the electronic media, the commercial electronic media, is so low. I don't know what it is, 9%, or, I mean, it's really, I think it might be below 10%. Because the pain and the dislocation and the injustices that have been carried out are ignored by the elite. And they've all become like courtiers in, Louis XIV in Versailles, commenting on which mistress he took into the bedchamber. While the real world, what's happening outside their version of the Forbidden City is completely unreported and more dangerously unknown. So when the Republican establishment wants to destroy Trump during the primaries, remember who they trotted out to destroy him? The big gun? Mitt Romney. Wow. So Trump's finished there,
You talk about the need to create alliances and listen to people unlike ourselves, and you are critical of people who write off Trump supporters. You say in the book, the left often dismisses Trump supporters as irredeemable racists and bigots, ignoring their betrayal and suffering. Yet, in the same chapter, you also called President Trump an imbecile and a narcissist. Do you see any contradictions in that message?
No, because Trump has power. They don't. I went to divinity school, and that whole issue of forgiveness. And although I did have a great theology professor who once told me, only God forgives.
But if the goal is to create alliances with people, and he has who
are... Right, but we're talking about power. When people are carrying out, let's call it for what it is, Kant called it radical evil. When people are empowered to the extent that they are destroying and crushing human lives, ripping children from their mother's arms, and then putting these children in warehouses where they are drugged and abused, when they are carrying out militarized drone attacks, terrorizing citizens across the Middle East, including, of course, in Pakistan. when they are unleashing militarized police to gun down citizens in the street, when they are forcing families whose sons or daughters are ill into bankruptcy to save their children, then we have every right to call them out for who they are. And I look at the Trump supporters ultimately as victims. I don't defend their racism, their Islamophobia, their homophobia, all of that, of course, their misogyny, but they're victims. And I learned that lesson when I wrote my book on the Christian right. Because
Victims of what?
they're victims of a system that has cast them aside, crushed their dreams and their hopes, told them that they are worthless and have nothing to contribute. They have reacted the way victims often react in a society by demonizing the vulnerable. Let's not, just be clear, you have systems of indoctrination that spew this garbage out over the airwaves. And critics of the power elites, such as myself, have been effectively shut out. So they're being bombarded by Fox News. I mean, talk about fake news. This whole debate on the Russiagate, I'm thinking, no, if you want to go after the foreign government that has most interfered in American elections, that's Israel. If you want to go after fake news, we've got it on cable channels and on the radio. Sean Hannity, I mean, he's not sane, I mean, this guy. And they have huge corporate sponsors. They make tons of money. So you have a powerful system of indoctrination coupled with people who have bought this, as we spoke about earlier, this belief that what's happened to them is an assault against their national identity. It's been taken away from them by Muslims, I mean, it's of course absurd. Undocumented workers, women, African American, the list. And in degenerate societies, this is what I saw in Yugoslavia. We can watch it in India. I mean, how far is Modi from this? That's what happens. The power elites seek to divert this legitimate rage towards the weak. And so these people have been betrayed. The way that they're reacting is indefensible and ultimately self-destructive. But that is what happens in diseased and decayed society. I mean, I was in Montgomery, Alabama with the great civil rights attorney, Brian Stevenson, and we were walking through the city. And Brian was showing me all the Confederate monuments in the city. And then he said, most of these have been put up in the last 10 years. And I said, that is exactly what happened with the breakdown of Yugoslavia. All these Yugoslavs suddenly became Serb nationalists or Croat nationalists. I remember I was with the 5th Corps after the NATO bombing. We were moving with Dudakovich's 5th Corps on Banja Luka, and I was on the front lines, and I was with a battalion of quote-unquote shaheeds, so they all had green headbands. First of all these Muslims in Bosnia could drink, you, me, and anyone else in this room under the table. They hadn't ever been in a mosque. I mean, it was kind of like the Christian right. They knew a few kind of catchwords and cliches. So I'm with this battalion of, who are being demonized, of course, by the West. And they find out that I'd spent 7 years in the Middle East and I spoke Arabic. And then they all wanted to know if I'd read the Quran. And I was the only one of 900 people who actually read the Quran. Yeah.
So I'm told we're going to take some questions, but I did want to give you a chance to answer one criticism people have of your work, which is that your message is too bleak. It's too hopeless.
Well, my answer is...
What do you say to those people?
Right, I didn't make it up. I read climate change reports, and it's pretty bleak and pretty frightening. And we don't have much time left, and we better realize how bleak it is, and we better rise up and get rid of these people, or they are going to extinguish the human race.